One if by land, two if by sea. With these famous words, a revolution began. A revolution that changed the world. With the coming of the American Revolution, our nation's founding fathers understood and appreciated the critical need for secrecy. It meant the difference between victory and defeat, life and death.
We're always worried about the British intercepting our ships at sea because we were always worried about their reading our mail.
One of the principal concerns for our young nation was communication. Communicating and doing so in confidence. America's founding fathers turned to codes and ciphers in an effort to preserve the confidentiality of their correspondence. One of those men was Thomas Jefferson.
Most of us know that Thomas Jefferson was one of the principal authors of the American Declaration of Independence. What we don't know about him is that he was the founder of American cryptography.
Well, Thomas Jefferson early on understood the need for using book codes and would do so before the American Revolution for his private correspondence. He was eager to mask, as he said, dispatches for domestic correspondence and also for foreign correspondence.
Many items that tell the story of the birth of our nation can be found in the Library of Congress. One such document is the coded letter of the first Tory spy, Dr. Benjamin Church. A trained physician and confidant of Paul Revere, Church used his position to betray the Americans early in the war.
Benjamin Church was the first British spy caught and convicted by the Americans. His cryptographic letter, which was the evidence used against him, is in the Washington papers in the manuscript division in the Library of Congress.
Known as a substitution cipher, Church replaced letters of the alphabet with symbols. Each letter had a different symbol. Three of Washington's men, including Elbridge Gerry, quickly deciphered the letter.
The code itself is not a complicated code, and they were able to break it simply by counting the number of times that a particular number or letter or symbol was used, and then comparing that through a mathematical formula.
In his three-page enciphered letter, Church warned, should Britain declare war against the colonies, they are lost forever. Britain would lose the colonies, and Church, convicted by the Americans of espionage in 1776, would be lost at sea. This episode marks the beginning of our nation's experience with cryptology. While American code breakers had achieved their first victory in reading correspondence and detecting the first Tory spy, code breaking would play an even greater role in the battles to come. In 1782, with the British Army in Virginia desperately needing reinforcements, their commander, Lord Cornwallis, exchanged secret messages with Sir Henry Clinton in New York City. The Americans intercepted and deciphered the message, which helped end the war and changed the course of history.
While Lord Cornwallis was bottled up in Yorktown, Sir Henry Clinton in New York let him know that reinforcements would be coming, but they would be late. Encouraged him to hold on. This message, encrypted, fell into Patriot hands. We decrypted it, read it, and this enabled Washington to hold on with more tenor at Yorktown and helped set up the surrender of the last major troop of British soldiers in North America.
The man who deciphered Cornwallis's letter was James Lovell, who was also the first American to be convicted of spying. His letter, asking George Washington to secure his freedom, can be found in the Library of Congress's manuscript division.
James Lovell is probably the most important person as far as codes and diplomatic correspondence is concerned.
Cryptology was in part responsible for the American victory not only at Yorktown, but also for the ultimate victory over the British. With its roots firmly and deeply embedded in the success of our struggle to exist as a nation, coded communication would soon be nourished by the blood of yet another milestone in our nation's history, the Civil War. The war between the states tested the limits of the young nation. The question of slavery had been avoided, argued, and compromised upon from the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. By the 1860s, the issue could no longer be ignored. A shared common language, heritage, and culture made secret communication more difficult when it was between Americans. Armies quickly realized each other's strengths and weaknesses as men who were friends in peacetime met in battle. In the years prior to the Civil War, the U.S. perfected the electric telegraph and strung a wide network of telegraph wires across the country, making the United States a continental power. Fueled by cheap and plentiful land available for the taking, the expanse of the railroad and a remarkable new communications system invented by Samuel Morse, the telegraph, the Western migration changed American life.
Prior to the demonstration of the telegraph, as Morse conducted it in 1844, information could only be transmitted by horseback, by steamboat, or by rail.
On May 24, 1844, Morse sent the first telegraphic message over a 40-mile wire between the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. and a Baltimore train station using a code. Realizing the significance of his new tool, Morse's first message read, "What hath God wrought?" For the first time, communication had conquered distance.
His major contribution was the development of an alphabet code. This code was based on the simple idea of long and short electrical pulses, or dots and dashes. The advantages to the military were obvious, with the telegraph's ability to transmit information instantaneously.
The telegraph made war possible on a near continental basis. But the Morse-coded communications were vulnerable to unintended receivers. It was possible to intercept messages without the other side knowing they had been. Cryptology was needed to keep sensitive messages private. President Abraham Lincoln understood strategy and took advantage of the Union's superior communications strengths. The telegraph allowed Lincoln to communicate directly with his commanders in the field.
A general would establish his headquarters, and the telegraph people were on his heels, making sure that headquarters had access to Washington or to other detachments.
Lincoln placed great stock in this and used to go down to the telegraphic office in Washington frequently. Oftentimes at night he would go down there to get the latest reports from the battlefronts.
Lincoln was fascinated by ciphers, by military codes. He did not make any attempt to master the codes, but he seemed to enjoy putting a letter in form that it could be sent over the telegraph and perhaps not understood by the Confederates had they intercepted it.
So far as we know, the Confederates were never able to break into this system, notwithstanding the fact that they had captured books and they had captured telegraphers.
But the telegraph was not the only communications system used in battle. A visual system called the wigwag signal system was designed by Union Army surgeon Albert Meyer. This system used flags by day and torches by night to signal to battlefront commanders enemy movements. Confederate Lieutenant Edward Alexander helped Meyer perfect the system before the war. Alexander would later become the first to use this coded communication system at the Battle of Bull Run.
So on a hill later to be known as Signal Hill, Alexander and a few couriers sat watching the developing battle. And around 8:30, early in the morning, looking toward the stone bridge, Alexander caught something in the corner of his telescope, focused it more carefully, and realized that what he was seeing was the reflection of the morning sun on a brass cannon. Looking a little more closely, he realized that he was seeing a line of bayonets, and he quickly grabbed his flag and began to signal to one of his trainees at the stone bridge, "Look to your left, you're turned."
Alexander's coded signal on the morning of July 21, 1861, warning the Confederates of the Union's flanking movements, saved the South from certain disaster. The success of the Confederate victory at Bull Run ensured the broad acceptance of this new system, and the signal corps in both the Confederate and the Union armies began to expand rapidly.
For the first time in history, man had successfully communicated over the heads of the troops at a distance his thoughts, his words. This was a form of command and control that had probably been dreamed about since the first husky-voiced Roman centurion trying desperately to be heard above the din of battle and unable to communicate.
Perhaps during no other time in American history was coded communication more important than in the battle to end slavery. As the 19th century progressed, men and women of African descent who had been enslaved by their fellow countrymen were determined to find their freedom and reclaim their human dignity. That road to freedom had its own code name, the Underground Railroad. The railroad was a sophisticated network of passageways through woods, fields, rivers, and safe houses, every step made terrifying by the fear of recapture.
Most people get caught up in the Underground Railroad from a romantic point of view. People died on the Underground Railroad. People were killed. It was a human train. It wasn't made of wood. It wasn't made of steel. It was a human train.
Secret communication was crucial to the railroad's success. Information was often passed through song. Slaves used the Bible as a source for codes, delivering critical information through spirituals. These coded spirituals conveyed every kind of hidden messages imaginable, signals for escaping, hiding, and expressing imminent danger.
The slave master could not understand how a slave can work so hard and yet still they would have time to sing and be jovial in the evening, but while they were doing the buck dance, the cakewalk, whatever, they were singing songs, so they disguised their songs as codes.
The song "Steal Away" is one of the more commonly known examples of coded spirituals.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Now the slaves knew that the slave master would not understand what he was saying. They could not openly advocate that they were trying to slip away. So they knew that their fellow slave members would understand the codes that they were using when they were saying steal away. They were preparing to take off.
Steal away to Jesus, where he ain't got long to stay, for Jesus was like in heaven, and heaven was a code word for Canada, the North.
As far as the slaves trying to get the message across without the oppressor really knowing what they were saying, they used little code words by saying, "There's a great camp meeting." The slave masters then thought they were talking about their religious meetings, so they had no way of knowing that they were making connections with the Underground Railroad. And they would send the message to the other slaves by saying, "Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting on the other side."
Slaves took advantage of every possible opportunity to escape from bondage. And when their owners deployed packs of bloodhounds to track them down, fellow slaves alerted them to the oncoming peril. One of the songs used to elude their would-be captors was the spiritual "Wade in the Water."
There were many times when they had to escape along the riverside, And the slaves would sing, "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water."
Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water, children. God's going to trouble the water. Get into the water so the bloodhounds couldn't pick the scent.
One of those who escaped was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who rode the Underground Railroad to freedom. Douglass was greatly influenced by these spirituals. He would later write, "To those songs I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery." Today, his papers are found in the Library of Congress's Manuscript Division.
Frederick Douglass, as a young person, said, as a young slave, when he growing up in Maryland, when he heard the old folks singing about Canaan, old Canaan, Canaan from the land, the biblical land, the Bible, in his mind it meant old Canada. It was a coded word for Canada.
Oh, see that man all dressed in red. God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, it looks like
The church was always a home, always a place in the African American community where we felt safe, where we can plot, we can plan, we can discuss whatever.
Sometimes the coded messages were not only used for running away, but sometimes they would just be calling each other to a church service. That it was time to meet together to worship on some area of the plantation. A lot of times, particularly because in the Sunday schools, slaves were often taught how to read and write, and that was illegal after the 1830s in every slave state. There was just a real fear that in any kind of gathering involving blacks, that even if freedom was not the initial reason, that freedom indeed would actually grow out of any unsupervised gathering of blacks.
It was a period of desperation. A period where people were held against their own will. A period where people died. It was American history.